The showdown when silence speaks louder. Nobody expected fireworks at 8:12 in the morning. The lights in the studio were already too warm when Jasmine Crockett took her seat, hands resting firmly on her lap. She wasn't nervous. She didn't do nervous. Not when she spent years in courtrooms, in community halls, in offices where people called her too much before they even let her speak. Her navy blue blazer had sharp shoulders, and a single gold pin on her collar read, "Vote." Hair pulled back tight, not a strand out of place. Alert, thoughtful, calm. Then there was Clint Eastwood. He walked onto the set of American Square with the kind of quiet confidence that fills a room before he even says a word. Charcoal gray blazer that looked like it had seen better fights and didn't apologize for it. His handshake was dry and firm. He didn't smile, not out of rudeness. He simply never did. To Daniel Everett, the host with the personality of a weather app, it was the dream pairing. Young and old, rising star meets living legend, liberal bite meets conservative calm. The show opened with generic patriotic music, and the first questions were softball pitches. Congresswoman Crockett, you've been vocal lately about redirecting federal funds into education and housing initiatives. Some would say that a bold shift. It's only bold if you're not struggling, Jasmine replied smoothly. But if you're a teacher working 2 jobs or a vet sleeping in his car, it just sounds like common sense. The audience hummed with quiet approval. Clint sat still, arms crossed loosely, eyes squinting just a bit. Clint, you've always emphasized strength and discipline. Do you think we're coddling the next generation? Clint leaned in slightly. I think we're confusing kindness with leadership. This country was built on hard decisions, not handouts. Jasmine looked over at him. Steady. Or maybe we finally remembered what compassion looks like. The tension was there, thin but present, like fishing lines stretched across the table. In the control room, one of the producers leaned forward. Another whispered, "This might go viral if it breaks right." Daniel shifted in his chair like he could sense the storm coming. How do we bridge this growing divide between generations, between the people who built this country and the ones trying to change it? You don't bridge it by tearing down everything that came before you, Clint responded, his voice that familiar sandpaper tone. Too many of these new faces in politics think every idea before 1990 was a mistake. Change without backbone is just noise. A few audience members clapped, not loud, but deliberate. Jasmine let the silence stretch out just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Backbone without compassion. That's just cruelty. Her eyes stayed locked on Clint's. You're right. We should listen to the past. We should study it. And we should learn exactly where it broke people, where it failed people, because that's where the truth lives, not in nostalgia, not in muscle memory. Clint's brow furrowed slightly. You talk about strength like it's inherited, like age gives you automatic credibility. But strength isn't just surviving hard times. It's refusing to accept them as normal. Daniel tried to lighten the mood. Well, that's a perspective. Let's shift gears a bit. Clint, earlier you said something about leadership not being what it used to be. Could you expand on that? Clint nodded slowly, then glanced at Jasmine as if checking whether she could handle what he was about to say. I said that too many people in leadership today are more concerned with feelings than with facts. They talk tough, but fold the moment someone accuses them of being unfair. Then he turned toward Jasmine. You're smart. No doubt you've got presence. But leadership, real leadership, doesn't come from hashtags or protest signs. It comes from sacrifice, from knowing when to shut up and get the job done. The younger generation doesn't get that. They think being loud is the same as being right. The audience gasped lightly. A few claps, a few murmurs. The air got tight. Jasmine blinked, but her expression didn't change. Her fingers tapped once on the side of her chair, then silence again. Not from hesitation, but from calculation. Behind the scenes, a producer whispered, "We need to let this breathe. Don't cut the break." Millions watching at home were no longer thinking about breakfast. They were locked in. Congresswoman Crockett, would you like to respond? Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't glance at the camera or straighten her jacket. She just spoke quietly, clearly. I've never confused being loud with being right. But I also know silence has rarely served people who look like me. Clint turned slightly in his chair, his face unreadable. And while we're talking about sacrifice, what exactly are we calling that these days? Because I see a lot of people clinging to old ways and calling it bravery. I see people who want the credit of building something, but none of the accountability for the damage it caused. Then it happened. Clint took a breath and said, "Look, I respect anyone willing to serve, but let's not pretend like politics isn't theater now. I came from a time where you earned respect by keeping your head down and doing the work, not by turning every disagreement into some emotional meltdown on Twitter." He paused, then added with a smirk, "Especially when it's coming from women trying to play a man's game." The audience went dead quiet. Even the camera operator dropped his hand slightly. Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. Jasmine turned her head fully toward Clint. No expression, just focus, like she had just entered a completely different mental space. "You think I'm playing?" she said, calm as ever. "Is that what this is to you? A performance?" Clint didn't respond. "I don't know what game you think we're in, but I'm not auditioning for anything. I didn't get here because I made noise. I got here because I fought for people who weren't being heard. And the fact that you call that emotional, that's not just outdated, that's dangerous." No one moved. The studio had no script to fall back on. You say leadership isn't what it used to be. Maybe that's a good thing, because the kind of leadership you're talking about, the one that shuts people down, especially women, especially black women, has done enough damage. She said it flat, not dramatic. That's what made it cut deeper. Clint's eyes didn't move, but his silence spoke volumes. On social media, clips of the exchange were already being posted, dissected. A teenager in Fresno tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just folded Clint Eastwood like a lawn chair live." But in that studio, all that existed was a stare between two very different definitions of power. Jasmine wasn't finished. She could have raised her voice. She could have fired off 100 talking points like bullets. But that's not how she operated. She looked at Clint, really looked at him, and then turned slightly toward the audience, her voice steady. "You know what bothers me? Not the insult. Not the assumption that I'm playing a man's game. What bothers me is how normal that kind of thinking still is in rooms like this." No one moved. She adjusted the microphone on her lapel. "You spent decades playing roles where you were the last honest man in the room. You stood for justice, for grit, for something real. And now here you are calling women emotional because they don't stay quiet the way you're used to." She paused, not for effect, but to breathe, to let it be what it was. "You think the world went soft? That we're whining because we want rights you never had to ask for? But what if I told you that this generation doesn't lack backbone? What if it just finally grew one?" The camera zoomed slightly in. She didn't flinch. "Let's talk about sacrifice, since you brought it up. My mother raised 3 kids working 12-hour shifts in a hospital where she was called girl until she was 50. My father couldn't afford to see a doctor for 20 years because he had to keep the lights on. That's sacrifice, not silence, not stoicism. Sacrifice is choosing other people's futures over your comfort." Clint opened his mouth, then closed it. "I didn't come here to be liked," Jasmine said. "I came here because every time someone like me walks into these rooms, we're told to calm down, to wait our turn, to lower our tone. And every time we don't, we're told we're being too emotional, too loud, too much." She shifted slightly, letting the silence carry her next thought. "Maybe it's not that I'm too much. Maybe it's that you've been too little for too long." A collective gasp rolled through the audience. No clapping, no shouting, just stunned attention. Clint leaned forward now, jaw tense, voice lower. "You think that kind of talk builds bridges? You think calling people small wins votes?" Jasmine didn't blink. "I think telling the truth scares people who've lived too long without hearing it." Then Jasmine turned to the camera, something she hadn't done until now. There are girls watching this at home who've been told to quiet down in every classroom they've ever sat in. Women who've been told their ideas were too aggressive, their ambition too loud. And if one of them sees this and realizes she's not crazy for standing up for herself, then this conversation was worth it. The room stayed still. Behind the scenes, a camera operator whispered, "She just flipped the whole interview." Daniel took a breath. "We're going to go to break now." The network cut to commercial, but no one in the room moved for several seconds. Jasmine sat quietly, sipping from the mug in front of her. Clint rubbed the bridge of his nose. What had started as a debate about policy had turned into a defining moment, not because someone yelled or stormed off, but because someone finally said what too many people were too used to swallowing. When they came back from break, it was like nothing had happened. Daniel's voice was cheerful again, but it sounded thinner this time, like a worn-out drum beat. "Let's pivot to public opinion. Polls show a growing divide between younger and older voters on issues like police reform, climate, and economic justice. What do you make of that gap?" Clint didn't even look at the card. "I think the polls say what I've been saying. Young voters are living in a fantasy world. They want everything fixed without doing any of the heavy lifting. Real change comes with time and pain and compromise, not hashtags and moral tantrums." He said moral tantrums, like it was a term he'd been waiting to drop. Jasmine took a breath through her nose. "Not deep, just steady. You call it fantasy. I call it clarity. This generation isn't asking for miracles. They're asking for dignity, and they're tired of begging for it." She wasn't performing for the camera. She was just talking the way you talk when you've had this conversation 100 times already. They're not throwing tantrums. They're refusing to accept excuses. Daniel tried to bring it back to neutral. "But Congresswoman, wouldn't you say compromise is part of the job? Isn't that what leadership requires?" She looked at him and nodded slightly. "Compromise is important, but not when it's between truth and comfort. Not when the people making the decisions are the ones least affected by them." Clint cut in. "You act like we didn't fight for anything. Like everything good that exists now just fell into your lap." His voice had a sharper edge now. Tired, frustrated, defensive. "You think it was easy fighting through Cold Wars, recessions, riots? You think we just sat on our hands? We bled for this country. We buried friends for it." Jasmine waited until he finished. "I don't doubt you bled," she said quietly. "But bleeding isn't the same as building something everyone can live in." That landed harder than she intended, or maybe just as hard as she meant it to. "What I'm saying, Clint, is that pain doesn't entitle you to permanence. Just because you suffer doesn't mean your way of doing things should go unquestioned forever. This country doesn't owe anyone the comfort of never being challenged." Clint exhaled sharply. "You think you're the future. Fine, be the future. But don't disrespect what made it possible." "I don't," she said. "But I won't pretend all of it was right either. That's the difference." The final moments of the segment were awkward. A few throwaway lines about upcoming elections. Clint stared into the camera with the expression of someone who couldn't wait to get out of his chair. Jasmine stayed composed, almost still. It took less than 10 minutes after the show ended. Clips started flying across social media before the guests had even left the studio parking lot. A 26-second video of Jasmine saying, "Maybe it's not that I'm too much. Maybe it's that you've been too little for too long," racked up 300,000 views in under an hour. People reposted it with captions like, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard." On a popular Reddit thread, someone titled the post, "Clint Eastwood just got dismantled on live TV by a woman who didn't blink once." Young activists praised Jasmine for standing her ground. Retired veterans split down the middle. Some defended Clint. Others admitted, first privately then publicly, that maybe the world had moved past the old rules. By noon, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Jasmine Crockett clapped back. Hashtag not your game. Hashtag leadership looks different. A TikTok with side-by-side footage of Jasmine's response and a clip from one of Clint's old westerns ended with a caption, "The cowboy met his match, and she didn't even draw." It hit 1 million likes by dinner time. It wasn't all praise. Conservative commentators framed it as a publicity stunt. She didn't win a debate. She just went viral. Meanwhile, Jasmine stayed quiet. No follow-up interviews, no retweets, no statements. Her silence wasn't avoidance. It was power. By the next morning, op-eds were everywhere. The Washington Tribune ran a headline that read, "Clint Eastwood brought a legacy. Jasmine Crockett brought a mirror." But the moment that stuck with people most wasn't a clapback. It was her final words to the camera. There are girls watching this at home. That hit different. One mother from Ohio tweeted a video of her daughter, barely 12, watching a clip and whispering, "She talks like me." In homes across the country, conversations sparked. Not the loud ones, the quiet ones between mothers and daughters, grandfathers and grandsons, supervisors and interns. People weren't just debating opinions. They were examining patterns, unspoken rules, the lines they drew without knowing they had. Clint gave one interview the day after, sitting beside a large window in his Monterey ranch. When asked if he regretted what he said, he shrugged. "I spoke from my experience. If people don't like it, they don't have to listen." But people had listened closely, and what they took from that moment had less to do with who was right and everything to do with who finally felt seen. In that short, tense exchange, viewers saw their own frustrations at being dismissed, overlooked, silenced. They saw boardroom meetings where they had to explain their worth twice. Dinner tables where opinions got brushed aside with a tired laugh. Schools and workplaces where they felt the need to tone it down just to keep the peace. Jasmine Crockett didn't say anything revolutionary. She just said it without flinching. It wasn't about Eastwood losing an argument. It was about the world shifting quietly without asking permission. And what happens when old power finally meets new voice? And that voice doesn't ask to be let in. It pulls up a chair and says, "I'm already here." In interviews weeks later, Jasmine still refused to call it a takedown. "I wasn't trying to destroy anyone," she told the Fort Worth Ledger. "I was just tired of being talked down to." That wasn't about Eastwood. That was about every girl who's ever been told to smile more and speak less. Young people across the country wrote essays about that moment. Teachers used it in classrooms. Debate coaches played it for their students. Political science professors broke it down next to historic speeches, because in between the lines, this wasn't just a political argument. It was a cultural reset. And maybe that's the lesson. Sometimes leadership doesn't come with volume. It comes with clarity. Sometimes you don't change the world by yelling over your opponent. You do it by making them sit with a truth they never had to face before. Jasmine Crockett did more than speak for herself. She gave people permission to be direct without apology, to push back without rage, to be strong and soft in the same sentence, and most of all to know that calling out the past isn't disrespectful. It's necessary. Clint Eastwood didn't vanish. He still had his followers, his films, his weight in American culture. But something about that interview followed him now, not in shame, but as a reminder that even legends get challenged and that sometimes legacy means letting go. As for Jasmine, she never once called it victory. That wasn't the point. The point was being heard without asking twice. And that, more than anything, is what leadership looks like now. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, and turn on the bell.